We learned something today. It's the worst part. Okay, no, what? How do you start something like this? We found something out about Last Epoch today, and it is drastically changing how I evaluate skills, and specifically sub-skills. So first things first, I'm going to walk you through the conversation that took place on Discord. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to act shocked because I'm still shocked about this information. I'm going to show you what skills this applies to. I'm going to show you skills that this doesn't apply to. And the biggest takeaway is that Last Epoch needs consistency. It's only in 0.9 currently. If this were 1.0, this would be unacceptable because these skills are all over the place with regards to whether they work as expected or whether they don't work as expected. So the most important takeaway is like the game lacks consistency. I wish it didn't, but here we are. Let's go learn. There are skills in this game called sub-skills, okay? A sub-skill is a skill that is procced by its parent skill. Let's take a look at an example just so you know what we're talking about real quick. Let's go to Rip Blood. Rip Blood is a skill. You cast it on one single enemy. A sub-skill would be Blood Splatter, for example. So we could talk all about this if we need to, but suffice it to say, this is what a sub-skill looks like. It's a related ability. It does not have its own skill tree. It's just something that's procced. By the way, if you're on this website, lastepochtools.com, you hover over this, hold down Shift, and then move your mouse, and then you can hover over that. By the way, all right, there we go. Now we all know what we're talking about. So here's the conversation. You ready? This person says, also, if you're out there, God bless you for asking this question. He says, does the vengeance tree nodes apply to a riposte? Mike responds, he says, sometimes it's situational. He said, do these nodes with the arrows, do they apply to riposte? He says, I don't know what those nodes are. They're more damage nodes. Oh, I'd be shocked if all three of those nodes just do more damage. Stats are passed on to riposte like any other sub-skill. That's what I would say as well. So this person links all the skills. And we can talk about these, and we will talk about these. They say like riposte deals more damage if you're under 50% health. You know what? Let's pull this up right now. Let's go like this. I'm going to show you exactly the nodes that we're talking about, okay? Because this is important for the sake of the conversation. Let's go vengeance here. This has a node that says vengeance hits deal more damage conditionally against enemies that are already damaged. This one says vengeance, not hits, deals more damage. This node over here says vengeance. It does not say the word hits. Vengeance deals more damage if you're below half health. And then this one says, flips it if you're above half health instead of below. So that's what those nodes say. Those are the nodes in question. And then Mike goes on to say, conditional stats aren't passed to sub-skills. So while under and versed damaged do not apply. This is news to me. I think this is news to a lot of people. This is not how I thought the game worked. And in fact, in some scenarios that we've already tested, this is not how the game works. So this is learning something, but you're also discovering something, and you're also very confused. Me too. Let's go talk about some scenarios, okay? So thank you to Twitch chat, and thank you to some people who are hanging out in Discord as well, helping me track some of these down. We've got a list of sub-skills that are notable. Some of these skills are not notable. Fury Leap, you probably don't care about Fury Leap. It procs Lightning Bolts, but like, let's keep going, okay? There's some very notable things here. I'm going to talk about Umbral Blades, which is toward the bottom of this list here. So Umbral Blades has a conditional more multiplier, and let's go pull it up so we know exactly what we're talking about. Umbral Blades, very popular skill, super fucking strong. It has conditional more multipliers. So remember, the use case that we're talking about is verse damaged. Mike specifically called out things that say like verse damage. So that'd be like a stat that's on the enemy, right? So Umbral Blades is not exactly the same as what Mike was talking about because it's per stack of Dust Shroud on you. And then Umbral Blades has two very notable sub-skills. It has the Blade Storm node on the top left of the skill tree, and then it also has the Explosion in the top middle of the skill tree. These nodes do scale with the number of Dust Shrouds on your character. as expected, until you read what we just read today, which is very strange. There's another counterexample. I'm going to go over another counterexample right now. Let's go to Lich. We're going to talk about Wandering Spirits. Wandering Spirits has a sub-skill called Spectral Putrescence. The sub-skill itself is called Poison Spit. It's like the little, right? And the Poison Spit node, given what Mike says, what the developer says, you would suspect that this node here does not work, because this is a conditional more multiplier based on, it's like a toggle, a binary versus damned enemies versus cursed enemies. This node does work with Spectral Putrescence. So it's contrary to what the developer is telling us. Another very notable example, and instead of giving you counter examples, I'm going to give you examples that work the way that Mike, the developer, says they work. So this is news to me, and I'm pretty shocked at this point. Smite has these multipliers. It says Smite hits, deal more damage. Sorry, Smite hits have a chance to blind, deal more damage versus blind enemies. So it's hit damage versus blind enemies. And then you also have hit damage versus ignited enemies. And the sub skill in question for Fissure, we're not talking, sorry, for Smite, we're not talking about Fissure because Fissure does not hit. And we're only talking about hit damage, but we are talking about Lightning Blast, which is like the little lightning tendrils if you take the nodes on the right side of the skill tree. These nodes, news to me, do not scale with the conditional hit damage versus blind and the conditional hit damage versus ignited. We've tested this already. Wild. Totally wild to me. All right. We're going to pause for a second because I need to read a DM that just popped up in Discord for me. What's this DM say? Extrapolated. Expected. So it works? Are you saying it works? Is this another counterexample? It scales. That's wild to me. Okay, so I'm done reading my DMs. Let's go look at another counterexample. Remember, the information that we're working on comes from Mike, the developer, saying conditional stats are not passed on to subskills, which with Smite, Mike is correct. With Umbro Blades, this information is wrong. With Wandering Spirits, this information is wrong. And I think the most notable example that we found so far is a fan favorite skill, Shurikens. So Shurikens has a sub skill over here called Chakrams. Everybody and their mom loves Chakrams. And they're cool, I guess. They look neat. One of the biggest moral multipliers in Shurikens is this absolutely absurd multiplier over here, entry points. By the way, this is two separate moral multipliers. So it's not 90 plus 90 is 180% more damage. It's actually 90% more damage times 90% more damage. They're multiplicative. Back to the point. This node exactly fits what the developers are telling us about conditional modifiers not being inherited by subskills. But it clearly does. And I don't know how to feel about this information. The biggest takeaway that I said at the very beginning of this is that Last Epoch needs consistency. We need to feel as though our expectations and our knowledge about the game are being paid off. Like, oh, I looked at the skill tree. I think it's going to work this way because I know this and this and this. And I played the game for 1,000 hours and I read all these things. But currently it's not. Currently it's a toss-up. And there is no consistency on these things. And I really want consistency. I don't care if it works or not. I just really want consistency of my expectations. So for the end of this, let's real quick go over this list here. I've got a couple pieces of parenthetical information, but I'm just going to show you the whole thing, okay? So you can pause the video and zoom in or do whatever you need to if you really want to. But Swipe has a more multiplier versus slowed enemies. And you got to test Spirit Wolves. Does Spirit Wolves work with that more multiplier? Lightning Blast has a node that procs a Spark Nova. You got to go check this. Spark Nova, if this works, it would be like an entire new playstyle for how you could play Lightning Blast, because Lightning Blast is not good for an AoE skill right now. But more damage versus shocked enemies, more damage versus chilled enemies in the Lightning Blast skill tree, those are really important nodes. If they don't work, this is a huge deal. Spark charges, as an aside, we'll talk about this real quick. Remember, spark charges aren't a sub skill. They're actually an ailment that procs another skill. Spark charges are more similar to shadow daggers. If you have questions about that, ask me and I'll explain it to you. But yeah, spark charges are not expected to inherit more multipliers, so they don't. Fireball has some nodes. Conditional, it's got crit, like it's got more crit chance versus ignited enemies. I would expect that maybe it doesn't work with Flame Burst, the proc from Fireball, so you got to test that out. Static Orb has some very notable nodes. There's like a damage over time crit multi thing that you could do with Static Orb. It's like a big mana build. But the spell damage versus shocked enemies might not apply given what the developers have told us. So Meteor, you got to check this for Shrapnel. Shatter Strike, it has some ice spikes that might matter. Vengeance is the skill that the developer initially told us about, so we expect that none of the more multipliers work for Iron Blades. Warpath has a sub skill called War Slash. It's like when you release your thing, but some of the biggest more multipliers that you have are hits versus time rotted enemies per time rot on them, and hits versus ignited enemies. I expect that these don't work, but frankly, I would not be surprised if they do or don't work because I don't have expectations anymore, and that's kind of the problem. Writhe has an energy wave that you can proc. It might not benefit from more damage versus ignited enemies. Javelin is very notable. There's two different subskills which both represent fun, popular ways of playing Javelin. There's a Siege Barrage where you toss it up in the air and it rains down. And then there's Divine Fury where it hits an enemy and then, you know, forks or splits out like a Javazon. There's two more multipliers that are conditional. When farther away, I would test this one. And versus high health enemies, does it work? Who knows, dude? Smite we already talked about. Forward Strike has a sub skill called Detonating Ground and also has a more damage versus rare or boss enemies. Forward Strike is kind of an old skill. If this doesn't work, I wouldn't be surprised at all, but it's worded in a way that we need to test it. So go test it. Judgment has some interesting stuff. The only sub skill for Judgment is the Holy Eruption. The AoE elemental damage over time thing, the Consecrated Ground, is not a sub skill. It's just part of the skill itself. So that's out of scope. Marrow Shards is an example of a very old skill. So whether it works or not, or something else, I wouldn't be surprised anyway. But remember Marrow Shards, if you hold down Alt on one of the skills that talks about Bone Splinters, it will tell you explicitly that it only scales with exactly this thing and it doesn't scale with anything else. So Marrow Shards, I don't expect it to work, but I wanted to call it out because it's very old skill anyways. Sacrifice has some sub skills and more damage versus bleeding. Shurikens we talked about already. Umbral Blades we talked about already. Shadow Cascade is wild to me. I have no idea how Shadow Cascade works these days. It has more damage per active shadow, which I think is a conditional multiplier, which is what we're talking about. It has more damage if exact number of shadows on the bottom right of the skill tree. It has more damage per attack speed, and the sub skill that we're talking about is in the top right of the skill tree. It's called the Dagger Dance. So if any of those more multipliers do or don't work, I have no idea. You need to test them because all of a sudden we don't know how the game works. The last thing down here is Hail of Arrows. It's a little bit out of scope because Barrage of Arrows is not really the thing that you're trying to scale when you're playing a Hail of Arrows build. But if you are trying to scale your Barrage of Arrows damage, you should know that all of these more multipliers, bow damage versus ignited, bow damage versus stun, bow damage per stack of bleed on the enemy, might just not work. So what's the takeaway here? We need consistency. We need consistency and we need the game to match the expectations of what we know about. Like if we have information, if we learned these things and we spent all this time learning about Last Epoch, we should be rewarded for that by knowing how the game works. And currently it's a crapshoot. And every single time you want to do something weird, you got to test it specifically because it might just not work altogether. If you are playing a build that's impacted by anything that we talked about here, let me know in the comment section of this video. I would love to know about it. It'd be great. It just takes a lot of testing. Testing stuff is like half the game right now. If this game were already in 1.0, I would be much more critical of this. I already feel like I'm being a little bit critical of it, but it's it's 0.9. It's early access. It's a beta. Copium. Everything's fine. Chat, everything's fine. I promise everything's fine. Or at least I hope it will be in the future. I'll see you next time.